Holiness Pope Francis, President Inácio Lula da Silva, and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in their absence, and the Right Honorable and High Representative Aminata Touré next to me here, and the Under Secretary General of the UN, Lin Junhua, President Ramaphosa, and distinguished guests, respected members of civil society organizations, academia, and international organizations. I'm indeed honored to join this eminent gathering of global leaders, thinkers, to this profound, it did go off, to discuss a subject of profound importance, tax justice and its role in creating a fairer, more sustainable and inclusive world. And I extend my sincere gratitude to His Holiness Pope Francis and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, as well as the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, for convening us under the shared values of justice and solidarity. The preamble of the UN Declaration Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development says, we recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, a challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. It says all countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want, and to heal and secure our planet. And as we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind, unquote. In 2015, the African Union Heads of State and Government adopted two important strategic frameworks for inclusive growth and sustainable development. These were Africa's own Agenda 2063 and the UN Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. And naturally, the discussion about Africa's own framework for achieving sustainable development, Agenda 2063, fed into the continent's input into the discussions about Agenda 2030. We can therefore imagine the joy in Africa when Agenda 2030 committed all humanity to the objective that in the pursuit of the sustainable development goals in the up to the year 2030, nobody would be left behind. Agenda 23 itself had said that by 2063, the African countries will be among the best performers in global quality of life measures. And 2063 may be some distance away. However, in the context of the global pledge to leave nobody behind, 2030 is only 5 years away. And where are we with regard to Africa in this context? The various documents produced by the African Union, the African Development Bank, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the UNDP, and others, they say in the area that the number of SDG targets that require acceleration or reversal in Africa exceeds those that are on course. Africa is on track to reach only less than three of the 32 targets set for the 5 goals of ending poverty, eliminating hunger, combating climate change, promoting peaceful societies, and strengthening global partnerships, which means that less than 6% of the 32 measurable SDG targets are on target to be achieved by 2030. Africa accounts for more than half of the people living in poverty worldwide. And 70% of the world's extremely poor children are concentrated in Africa, making extreme poverty increasingly an African phenomenon. And as of April 2024, 20 out of the 38 low-income countries in Africa were either in debt distress or at high risk of distress. And several African countries face heightened rollover risks for their sovereign debts. And this heavy debt burden has impeded Africa's government's capacities to finance health, education, sustainable infrastructure, and the energy transition, among others. And to reverse the negative trajectory concerning the SDGs, Africa requires financing of about $1.6 trillion annually through 2030. And everything I've said, Madam President, makes the unequivocal statement that contrary to the solemn pledge made by the global community in 2015, Africa has been and is being left behind. The question arises naturally, whence will we acquire the resources radically to change this, referring especially to the $1.6 trillion a year until 2030 that we've mentioned. The Agenda 2063 development program we have mentioned of Africa says that one of the important objectives is to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, build continental capital markets and financial institutions, and reverse the illicit flows of capital from the continent in order, among others, to enhance domestic savings, eliminate all forms of illicit outflows, and double the contribution of African capital markets in development financing. All this is very correct and relevant in the context of Africa's development, but for our purposes today, I'll comment only on the matter of what Agenda 2063 referred to as reversing the illicit flows of capital from the continent. And the latest estimate of these IFFs from Africa says that the continent is losing $88.6 billion annually. In 2012, the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa established a high-level panel on these illicit flows. And that report was accepted by heads of state in 2015. We found that organized criminal activity accounts for 30% of the IFFs from Africa. 5 are related to corruption. And we established that 65% of the IFFs are tax-related, deriving from the activities of commercial enterprises. Obviously, we then paid a lot of attention to what each African state must do to combat the illicit financial outflows. However, it was equally obvious that such combating of IFFs required international cooperation, as the outflows from Africa ended up in other jurisdictions in the world, including the tax havens. We had actively encouraged and were therefore very pleased with the adoption by the UN General Assembly of the resolution which authorized negotiations towards the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. We were also greatly encouraged when the G20, meeting in Brazil last year, as President Lula just said, agreed on measures relating to ultra-high net worth individuals to ensure that these also contribute their fair share of taxes. In 2023, the South Center commented on an outcome statement made in July of that year by 138 member jurisdictions of the OECD G20 Inclusive Framework, that's a two-pillar solution, and said, and I quote, it highlighted the inclusion of rules that have the practical effect of reducing the tax payable to developing countries under Amount 1, Amount A, the limitations of Pillar 2, and other key aspects of the OECD proposed rules that require attention by developing countries before they decide to be tied up by such rules, unquote. I mention this, Madam Chairperson, because it emphasizes the importance of this eminent gathering, whose outcomes will justify why all of us have joined His Holiness Pope Francis to reflect on the critically important matter of tax justice and solidarity towards an inclusive and sustainable common home. And thank you very much for your attention.